Hello, my name is Adam Cheatham. I'm Director of Strategy and Transformation at Third Stage Consulting. And today I want to talk to you guys a little bit about the difference between public space and private space when it comes to ERP. At the very highest level, there are some similarities and there are some differences between these two spaces. Public space, of course, being more government oriented and the private space being more capitalist oriented, business oriented. There are some organizations like NGOs and nonprofits that will lean towards one space or the other, but for the most part, public versus private is an interesting study when it comes to similarities and differences. The easiest place to start is with the differences, so we're going to start with the similarities first. All in all, with an ERP system, finance serves as the center of an ERP system and it has the closest relationship to data and the use of data. So for whether you're public sector or private sector, that's going to remain the same. You're going to want to know where your money comes from. You're going to want to know where your money goes. You're going to want to know whether or not you are spending too much here or there. Whether that's oriented towards profit or not is immaterial when it comes to traceability of money. The difference between public and private sector starts to peel apart when in the finance space when you do start talking about the difference between profit versus traceability of funds and what revenue sources are. But at the end of the day, finance modules they all generate invoices, they all have receivables, they all have payables. There's a GL code structure, a chart of accounts, and all of those types of things. And that's fairly similar no matter who you work for and what type of system you work with. ERP is always going to have a finance component of it. Another space in the ERP environment that is very similar in the public space versus the private space is in the human resources component of it. Businesses and public organizations alike hire, fire, train, and develop their individual human resources, and being able to do that is something that is pretty similar between software systems and in the public space and in the private space. Some of the core transactions are also very similar, where in public and private spaces you'll talk about work orders, you'll talk about purchase orders, you'll talk about invoices and those types of transaction-based forms. Those are all very similar, and there are some shared commonalities amongst the bunch. After that, the differences between the two start to kind of take over. In a public space, finance and HR certainly are heavy components, but you have a different client base. The purpose of existence is different for a public entity than it is for a private entity. So the people that the folks that work for a public entity work for are their constituents. They are people like you and me, cities, counties, states. They all serve a population of people, and their job is to offer the service of government to those people, whether it is in the form of libraries, fire departments, police departments, in some cases, hospitals and healthcare services, community development services, and anything that you can think of that your local, state, or federal government handles for you. Those are all things that are going to, one way or another, end up in a public space ERP. How involved is up to the individual client, but they can end up in a public space ERP. Most of those things aren't concerns of private sector organizations, businesses, and companies that are designed to make profit. Their job is to sell a particular good or service to a person in exchange for money that is calculated as profit when there's a difference, profits or loss. That's a bigger story because they are self-funded. Businesses have to create their own income, whereas there's a little bit more of a sense of funding from a perspective of public sector. Public sector's revenues are quite a lot different than private space revenues. They come from the taxpayers and in other forms, grants and things like that. And because they come from those forms, the traceability of money is handled differently. When it comes to businesses serving for the purpose of making profit or maximizing shareholder value, that margin is the more important part of it, and you're manufacturing a component or offering a service. So when we talk about work orders, for example, you have in the public space, a work order may involve something more along the lines of maintenance and public works and projects based on creating a building or a street or a public space. A work order for a business, on the other hand, is usually more oriented towards manufacturing, the production of a widget, if you will. And so there's a bit of a difference there, because a widget is going to have a bill of materials and a routing that goes through a set of pieces of machinery that create that. In the public space, that work order is going to be designed towards the completion of services, and that work order is then going to be brought in as a cost of providing those services to the population. The cost of the work order for a public space is going to be more oriented towards the cost of goods sold, and is meant to be minimized as to maximize profit. And the way that that's tracked and traced from a perspective of cost accounting and stuff like that is different in the private sector. We also talked a little bit about purchase orders as similar transactions that occur in both public sector and private sector. The driver of a purchase order in each of those spaces can often be very different. It does come from more or less from a work order in some cases, that's true. But in the public space, you create a purchase order to obtain materials for production. Either that, or you're going to be acquiring specific assets so that you can procure those as well. The purpose is procurement for the basic function of creating a product. When it comes to government organizations, public sector organizations, those purchase orders are more heavily oriented towards things like fixed assets if it's for an actual item, and they are more heavily oriented towards the completion of services for the constituency when it comes to public space and public works. Purchase orders for either side are going to cover the professional services side of things. If you're going to hire somebody to do a job, it's a purchase order in both spaces. So there are some similarities there, but the general purpose of these transactions is slightly different. Whereas maximizing shareholder value is the point of the private space, maximizing constituency value is the general purpose of the public space. So those all manifest differently in ERP systems. Frankly, they manifest differently in CRM, WMS, HCM systems, HRIS, and all of those types of environments where, because the purpose is different, the system is different. And you'll find that there is some overlap between vendors who provide services and software for each of those spaces, but you'll find most times, because of the stark differences and the purposeful differences between public and private space, that the software packages that are offered by those vendors are very different. So if you have more questions about the differences between the public space and the private space, particularly when it comes to software and digital transformation, I'd love to talk to you. Reachable in a number of ways, so please feel free to reach out directly. Find me on LinkedIn, follow Third Stage on LinkedIn, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We put out a lot of great content. So thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.